review. So yesterday we watched the rest of that video. Great video, really, I think it's so well done. And we will watch another one next week called The 20s, a walk through the 20th century. So the battle of the 20s. And then about what goes on in total war. And first off, what is the name for the kind of authoritarian state that Mussolini would model after? Yeah, totalitarian. And what does every country want from its people? When they're total war, no dissent, they want what? Yeah, social unity, everyone together. Dissent could mean the enemy's winning. And what does every country do to free speech? Yeah, in some way they suspend it. And it doesn't matter if they're the most democratic republic in the world or a dictatorship, they all do it in total war in some way. Obviously, the United States did, you just did the assignment. And got you. Oh, the new rules of war then? Yes. Is that where we quit? Yeah, so they started the idea of using that as a weapon of terror on civilians. Propaganda. Oh, we got the propaganda. I almost forgot propaganda. And propaganda, what is the number one thing it tries to promote? It's like nationalism, what's the other? Hate the enemy. Is propaganda true or false? It can be true, but it's always dishonest in this. Because they're not telling you the whole story. They want you to believe a certain point of view. So they're going to push something. Oh, what's the best kind of propaganda? What's that? Yeah, you don't know. It's the best. When they seem like they're so unbiased. By the way, if anyone ever tells you they're unbiased, they're probably the most biased person. That is like a red flag saying, boy, they must be biased. Because they feel so conscious about it, they gotta hide stuff. I'm of course unbiased, but everybody knows I'm of course biased. And you are too. You better be. That's what called having a point of view is. The whole thing is you have to be able to filter through it and also filter through your own. So, which gas would be used the most? Yeah, it wasn't the most deadly, but phosgene, which was so much more deadly, was lighter than air. Mustard gas would float along the surface. And even though it wasn't as deadly, it's just a little bit of it, especially eyes, throat, nightmare. So, I think we got this, showed you this, right? So that's what the thought was. And the thing about poison gas is, I don't think I mentioned this, but, or maybe right before the bell rang, it's a really easy step. Because once you decide it's okay to use poison gas, it's okay to use, therefore, horrific incendiaries, like phosphorus or napalm possibilities. It's already, that's poison gas, what's the difference, right? So why not just burn entire cities down and burn to death or suffocate thousands, right? You already used poison gas, what's the difference? And then it's a incredibly easy step. From we're burning whole cities down, what's the difference between burning a whole city down with napalm, which is jelly gasoline, or incinerating an atomic bomb? What's that much of a difference? Which I should add was the exact logic used by American planners. It's the difference, Robert. Burning alive thousands of Japanese civilians. What's the difference? It's huge, but still, it's an easy step. The logic of total war is forbidden. So here we have kids preparing for it, and then you can get really, really ugly tattoos. By the way, you know that's some guy, right? I could see maybe a woman, but no, it's some guy who, my guess is that's the kind of tattoo you would see on somebody. Which my first instinct would be what he's supposed. Hopefully. Who asked that? Wait, you're making fun of my tattoo. Oh, one more thing I should add, anybody gets a tattoo like that, you're going to get older. Skin moves. That would turn into the tattoo of a blob. So, 2, starvation blockade. There have been starvation blockades as long as there have been sieges. And also trying to use, biological warfare spreading disease. I mean, this has happened before. but never on the industrial scale that they were capable of in modern war with modern equipment. And so this shows the importance of imports. Right before the war, 78% of food stuff was imported into Britain. If Germany could just cut that a little bit, that could lead to starvation in Britain. Germany is less, 38%, but still, if they cut off exports, especially of fertilizer, that could devastate Germany. So the blockade could destroy an entire population. And so the Allies would do a starvation blockade with the goal of starvation and terrorizing the public of Germany. And the blockade, as I mentioned before, someday, here, there, on the coast here. And it was incredibly effective. And basically the rules of war were this. There were rules. In fact, the International Court had been created 20 years before. And the idea was, is there certain norms. But remember, I just gave you how poison gas, bombing civilians, those norms are being thrown out. But if we're blockading a ship going into an enemy port, like a neutral ship from, let me throw a country out, the US. Stop, search for contraband that could help the war out. By the way, what goods can help the war out? Yeah, all goods. So, they just cut everything. And they must be escorted to a neutral port or a friendly port where the goods will be housed. If they have to be sunk, the crew must be either taken on board, returned, or make sure to put on life rafts. Ever got that? Basic idea. That was supposed to be the least or the last measure. So they started stopping ships. So what's going to happen? No one's going to go into Germany, especially when they cut off the neutral country of the Netherlands. Dutch were furious, but they cut them off. That means a lot of American ships are going to be stopped in the high seas. And soon they're just going to trade everything to the Allies. Why mess with it? Over 98% of U.S. trade to belligerents by the end of 1915 was the Allies. To the German point of view, they're like allies. So, and it worked. They had a bad crop year in 1915, really bad winter for various reasons in 1916, and then Germany made a number of insane decisions. Insane. And by 1916, there were food riots all over Germany. Here's a victim of food riot, a bakery that had been attacked. And they had just a terrible system of getting food from the countryside to the cities. The cities was a nightmare. The German government was more decentralized than people realized, with just all kinds of problems. And they made a bunch of really stupid moves. Like, for example, livestock. Livestock eat butter and grain, whatever, to survive. And that's wasting food. So what should we do? They killed all the livestock at once. Oh, sure, I guess that saved a little bit of food. But you combine that with a bad crop year, and it led to starvation by this fall of 1916. It was a foolish move. They killed all livestock, except for horses and a few cattle. In fact, that's going to be known as the turnip winter. That's one of the few things they could get turnips going on potatoes. And so here is, by 1918, this is a horse that had been used for delivery animal, died of starvation, and the people are just swarming it. Carve off every little bit of food. That's one it's black and white. Actually, it's sepia, it's kind of brown. And you see the guts, those will all be gone too. Right? And it gives you an idea of the level of starvation. The Germans are going to overstate the number of people starved, especially after the war, but we know it's in the hundreds of thousands. A pretty solid estimate is that at least 293,000 Germans and Austrians starved to death because of the blockade. Almost all of them, that's what we have to get. Almost all of them. Almost all of them. Because think about it, your first few years, that's where you need the most calories. In fact, all the way through to, late teens. You guys require more calories than me. And I'm on a 35,000 calorie a day diet. So you guys have to eat about. No, I don't need as much for them old and decrepit, but you guys eat a lot more. And they're going to get a name for that, as I mentioned before, the starvation charge. Come back to this. And to show you how this was a measure of total war, when the war ended, on what day did the war end? Do you remember? Yeah. They kept the starvation blockade going for 6 more months after the war ended to force Germany to sign the treaty. Think the Germans got that? I can think of one party in particular that's going to use this after the war, especially when it becomes out of nowhere, became big in 1929. Yes, the National Socialists. So the Germans could not use their fleet to blockade Britain. But knowing Britain was so dependent on imports, they used submarines. The Germans called submarines U-boats for Unterseeboats, the very descriptive German language. Unterseeboats, under the water boats. By the way, anybody know what Germans call paratroopers? Fallschirmjäger, soldiers that fall from the sky. Very descriptive language. Germans got a word for everything. Black Fliegengage means a face that deserves to be punched. And that's a word I wish we had a name for, because we all know somebody like that. Or one of us might be that person. But okay, moving on. Now, submarines run to the same rules of war as a blockade. Stop the ships, let the crew out. But I think you might know the problem with submarines. The submarine's defense is not armor. And these submarines back in 1915, slow, especially German submarines. British had better subs. The Germans had to use them. Submarines' only defense is to submerge. And if you get a hole in a submarine, kind of worthless, isn't it? Oh, they'll submerge. And they'll just keep submerging. And they can only stay underwater for a limited amount of time. You can't run a diesel engine underwater, because where does the exhaust go? So they have to be on batteries. And the batteries then maybe 15 hours. That's it. And so they have limited defense. If they surface, they're vulnerable. And the British quickly learned that, and they began to disguise freighters as gunboats. They call them Q-boats. Submarine would stop them, and then they would open fire. One hole, that's all it takes. So in 1915, they decided to start sinking without warning. So what weapon do submarines use? Torpedoes were a brand new weapon, and they're not guided. So they basically just try to time it to hit. They didn't carry very many torpedoes, so it was very risky, and they're very slow. And so all submarines would do is plant themselves here and here and wait for an enemy ship. Why sinking without warning? Remember the second part of total war, terror. Terror. Add that terror element to the destruction of their raw materials for industry. So they begin to sink ships. Almost immediately they start sinking ships that had either American passengers or might have been American flag. And then in May 1915, a passenger liner, a British passenger liner called the Lusitania, known for its speed, but also really poorly designed, so it sunk really fast, was sunk right here off the coast of Ireland. All kinds of mistakes happened. The Germans sank it, killed over 1,200 people, with over 100 Americans. Bodies be washing up on the shore for months. And the United States was furious, absolutely furious of what happened with the Lusitania. The Germans tried to make it like it was a great event, but the Germans pulled back from unrestricted submarine warfare. But this showed the terror of it. We will come back to this, as you can see from this cartoon. And once again, the brilliant use by the Allies of German culture. So, sinking ships without warning, starvation blockade. Let's get to number 3, bombing civilians from the air. So, same deal, technology wasn't quite there. The Germans had it first because they had perfected a lighter than aircraft called a Zeppelin and or a dirigible. Zeppelin's named after the creator, so I always call them Zeppelin too, because Zeppelin's kind of fun to say. Right, try it, Zeppelin. Right, everyone, try it. Zeppelin. Is that kind of fun to say? You gotta admit, it's kind of fun. Dirigible, yeah. And the Germans practiced for years by bombing sheep. And so you can see, okay, I just find this picture really funny. It's one of Zeppelins, and they wanted to say, okay, we want to show how big a Zeppelin is, which most Zeppelins are going to be, for example, or would be longer than a football. They're massive. And they wanted to show how big it was, and so they actually did old school cut and paste of putting this Zeppelin flying over sheep. Because naturally, when I think of lighter than aircraft, I think of bull. I think of mutton. I find that ship really funny. It's not a blimp. It's not a balloon. You notice it has a frame inside. There's a steel frame inside. It's covered by cloth. And then inside they put big balloons they call bladders full of a lighter than air gas. So people could get into this. Or you could put cargo, passengers, or bombs. They flew really slow, but had a really long range. In fact, the Germans are going to try to get a Zeppelin. And they thought they could do it to fly all the way from Berlin down to map here. Just a sec. I don't have a good map, but all the way down to Central Africa, the German colony there. And it almost made it until they ran out of oxygen. But they had this, and they didn't have really a source of helium. The only source of helium was from the United States, which they can't get because of the blockade. So what lighter than air gas did they use? Do you see a problem with hydrogen? They tried to bomb at night, which they couldn't anything. And the British learned really quick. They put high velocity guns and they could knock them out of the air. They're moving about 70 miles per hour, and they're bigger than a football field. They're not hard to hit. So they bombed at night. What can you hit at night? The ground. They would just aim for London. I hope they hit London. And remember, London then was about 8 million people. So they began bombing at night. That is a Zeppelin taking off. And they carried about 3,000 pounds of bombs. Half of them didn't go off. This is just random bombing. This is terror. Here are British spotlights, a painting of it, trying to light up the Zeppelin. Spotlights become one of the most important things for air defense. World War II, known for that, spotlights. It wasn't all that effective in any way, except for a little bit of terror. The randomness of death. So I was thinking of walking tour in London. This is 2013. I was in London. And I love walking tours, a little historical walking tour in London. It was really fun. And I'm standing there listening to the guy, just the tour guy. I highly recommend walking tours. Got a good guy there, fantastic. And I just happened to kind of look down and I saw this. These premises were totally destroyed in these applications. Actually, what I saw first was this little candy bar right here. And so I took that picture, the candy bar was delicious. And don't eat things you find on the ground. That's another life lesson, right? I've given you lots of life lessons. Don't marry your cousin. Don't eat things you find on the ground. I'm here to help. But aircraft technology was changing. At first, they just tried to drop basically like these almost like comical looking bombs. They never hit anything. Here they're putting German hand grenades. They use stick grenades. A stick and an explosive on the end. The Americans called them potato mashers. But not a lot of effect. But by the end of 1917, they started having 2- and 4-engine bombers. And by 1918, British and French bombers could reach most German cities in this area here, the most industrialized region of Germany. Remember I told you they're already thinking. So they go hand in hand together. Here's a German propaganda poster of what England is going to do, and that is destroying our cities. And so that's propaganda, hate. And the thing is, World War I, they just started. World War II, the assumption was waves of bombers killing civilians, thousands, and poison gas. It goes hand in hand. Once you open the door to say, hey, it's okay to kill civilians, where does it stop? You combine that with poison gas, some Marines, where does it stop? Oh, it stops in a horrible place. Number 4, Jackson. So we know what genocide is. If I say you know a definition, let's make sure we get a good definition of genocide. So it is state-sponsored, and what makes genocide unique for the 20th century and on, it's industrial. Yeah, there'd be killing of people, pogroms, forced removal of people, but this time it's different because of the industrial nature of a modern society. And it has nothing to do necessarily with anything people have done. It's by their identity. It's their identity. Ethnic group, and I have no idea. Oh, I'm sorry. Ethnic group, racial, nationality. It could be believed. Somebody that you have as a pariah. Somebody you could say it's not like us, them. Something about the way they look, what they believe, who they worship, how they worship, I guess is what I meant to say. That makes them different. A pariah, somebody we can't trust. Somebody who we can blame for all the problems in the war. That is genocide. And when I say total war was the worst thing ever created, I think these four things should sum it up pretty good. Genocide. The word wasn't even invented yet. We're still 40 years away from the word. So, remember total war that be no dissent? But what about a group of people that you don't trust by who they are? Their identity. And when you're in total war, fight to the finish, where you have an enemy trying to overthrow your government, what if you can't trust that group within your country? You can't kick them out, you're at war. What do? Do you allow that enemy to survive? And this is the horrible logic of total war. What do you do about a group you can't trust? And you're going to fight to the finish for your very survival. This is the horrible logic, I repeat. So, you have this potential enemy within. And what if the enemy starts doing well? And we can see elements of this many times in history. They just didn't have the industrial backing. If you know anything about the French Revolution, that was the terror, an enemy within, and we have people attacking us and doing well. You need a scapegoat. Nobody wants to blame themselves. The people in power don't want to blame themselves. So they find someone to blame. A pariah. Them. Who do you blame? Things aren't going well. And remember total war, you're not sure. So where did it first happen? It's called the Armenian Genocide. And this is what we have to get in the Ottoman. Now, you'll hear it a lot of times as Turkey, but they weren't Turkey yet. But to this day, Turkey will not admit it happened. And the Armenian Genocide, this map does a pretty good job of explaining the years, 1915 to 1923. The worst years were 1915, 1916, so. But it went on until 1923. And what happened was this. 1915, the Ottomans entered the war, and they did a hasty attack on Russia. Terrible attack. Unprepared, it was winter, they wanted in the mountains. They attacked right here. Not only were they defeated, they had a pell-mell retreat, and the Russians swept in and took about this much area. Why did they lose? Well, you can imagine the leaders of Turkey. The Pasha, as he was known as. The Sultan was a king, but he really had no power. We don't want to blame ourselves. So we blame enemies within. Yeah.
Does that have to be as a whole?
No. Because it's this destruction. And so if you just force someone to, like a gunpoint, leave their homes, you just potentially destroy their population because they can't really have children. So good question. Because a lot of times people think it's just simply, like, literally just killing, shooting, gassing. It's more than that. Good question. Now, the ethnic Armenians, which I should add, they are Christian. The Ottoman Empire's majority of Sunni Muslim, not a Shia Muslim. I should add the Ottoman Empire, for the most part, didn't care what religion you were. But if you were Muslim, you had to pay more taxes. And why you pay your taxes doing anything more? They just want the taxes. So the Armenians lived here. That's where ethnic Armenians majority there. And you'll notice there's a province in Russia called Armenia, which is today the country of Armenia. And so that's how the blame came. There were Armenian soldiers. Not here. There were Armenian soldiers in the Russian army. And there are Armenian soldiers in the Ottoman army. They drafted everybody. And so what did they decide? We wouldn't have lost if not for the Armenians. They betrayed us. And so we got to get them away from areas that are important. And so they began to force them out of their homes into areas, and you can see them, they started setting up, at first, they just started marching at gunpoint to the interior of the country, and then started massacre. And the term for forcing them by gunpoint out of their homes, and it is a form of genocide, is called ethnic cleansing. It's called ethnic cleansing. That comes from the 1990s in Yugoslavia, in the horrific civil wars there. If you force people at gunpoint and disrupt their entire life, their population collapses. And so that is a form of genocide. But then, at sites where there are red circles, they start to massacre. Shoot them with the machine guns, the new industrial weapons of war, and then those survivors were taken to a series of camps here. And there are a lot of observers who saw that, including people in the United States. And so here are Indians who were gunned down. Once again, I chose pictures of black and white. Hundreds of thousands who were not shot were marched out into the desert of what is now northwestern Iraq and marched to the camp. Then many more would be starved to death in concentration camps. The survivors would be basically forced out of Armenia, and it would go on in the low-grade ethnic cleansing until 1923. Here are survivors trying to get support around the world for what happened there. And for reasons it's very odd to me. They dug up the corpses of Armenians who died, so they closed in front of the head skulls. Which I just find this very odd. These are stories from the New York Times in 1950 to 1960. What happened? So they were murdered because of people they did not necessarily trust. And then total the logic. I can't emphasize that enough. It's the logic of total war. The Germans were appalled. They thought this would weaken their ally, would anger people around the world, and they needed the Ottoman Empire to survive. But they didn't. They most certainly would not stop giving the Ottomans weapons. They needed it. And so the Armenian genocide. I think my guess is a few of you knew about this, right? You knew? You knew? 1938, Germany. The German population was less than 1% Jews, very convenient scapegoat for why they lost World War I. Even though the big enemy was communists. And Hitler had been doing everything, the Nazis had been doing everything to try to force the tiny population of Jews to leave. And what happened? What happened? But they knew war was coming. And so a whole new series of restrictions. And a few of Hitler's aides, including Albert Speer and others, basically asked Hitler, are we sure we want to get this repressive? Because it will turn public opinion against us when we're not ready for war. We're going to have war. We got to be ready. And Hitler responded with, it doesn't matter. Today, he said this in 1938. Today, who remembers killing? I should have. The Jews who were able to flee Germany are tiny amount. Most of them went to most of you know what's going to happen in history. When Germany took Poland, there will be a horrible repression in the Jews. But then the total war in the world started in the Vatican. That led the U.S. take any absolutely marginal. Unless you're really famous. I mean, I know you. Yeah. Not something to be too proud of, but genocide. Oh, would the U.S. go on to steps towards this? Hey, we did in World War I and really did in World War II. Japanese American citizens of the United States were put in concentration camps. We very carefully called them deportation camps, because concentration camps are always in that country. And that is an Ottoman official taunting starving Armenian children. The country of Turkey will not admit this to this day. Part of the reason Turkey was not allowed to the European Union when they tried to get into it 20 years ago was because they did not admit it. And this is a big deal today. People of Turkish descent are very divided on it. I've had a lot of students of Turkish descent, and they are split. Some will say the Turkish national government position it never happened, and some say, oh yeah, we all know. Which is very fascinating how people tend to want to forget their history. Do it here. So let's get now to the rest of the world. Let's get to the US. By the way, I told you about total war and I spent a lot of time on it. It's really important. When I get to World War II, you guys just got to understand, everyone just jumped right into total war. They just jumped right in, all those facets. So, US neutrality. US during the war, US maintained neutrality. But US made a lot of money off of trade. In fact, by 1915, almost 98% of US trade went to the Allies. To the German point of view, by the end of 1915, the US is kind of an ally. And a lot of dog reference.